before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, this continent held more people than England, more languages than Europe, more nations than the Holy Roman Empire, societies that had been here not for decades or centuries, but for millennia. But if you were asked to name even 5 of them, could you? In the year 1491, 1 year before Columbus set sail, North America was home to an estimated 5 to 15 million people from the Arctic coastlines of what we now call Canada, through the Great Plains and eastern woodlands of the present-day United States, down into the deserts and valleys of Mexico. Hundreds of distinct societies occupied this land. They were not a single people. They did not share one language, one government, one way of life. They were as diverse as the continent itself. This matters because the question, who lived here, does not have a simple answer. There was no single indigenous culture. There were the Haudenosaunee in the northeast, the Mississippian city builders in the southeast, the Ancestral Puebloans in the southwest, the Chumash along the Pacific coast, the Inuit in the Arctic, and hundreds more. Each adapted to their environment. Each developed their own systems of governance, trade, and belief. Each left a mark on the land that in many cases is still visible today. Let us begin in the Northeast. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, were a union of 5 nations who governed themselves through a sophisticated political system. Decisions were made through councils. Leaders were chosen by clan mothers. This was not rule by force, but by consensus and negotiation. Their influence extended across what is now New York and into surrounding regions. They built longhouses that could hold entire extended families. They cultivated the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in fields that sustained large populations. Now move west to the Mississippi River Valley. Centuries before 1492, this region had been home to Cahokia, a city of earthen mounds and thousands of inhabitants. Though Cahokia itself had been abandoned by the time Europeans arrived, the Mississippian tradition continued in societies like the Natchez and the Caddo, communities organized around ceremonial centers, sustained by agriculture, connected by trade. Travel further west into the arid Southwest. Here, the descendants of the ancestral Puebloans lived in multi-story stone and adobe structures built into cliffsides and mesas. The Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples managed water with precision in one of the driest regions on the continent. They built irrigation systems. They stored grain. They created art and ceremony tied deeply to the cycles of the land. Move north into the Great Plains before the horse, brought later by Europeans. Plains societies like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Pawnee lived in a landscape dominated by buffalo. They followed migrations. They built temporary dwellings. They developed methods of preserving meat and using every part of the animal. Survival required mobility, cooperation, and intimate knowledge of the environment. And on the Pacific coast, societies like the Tlingit, Haida, and Chumash lived in resource-rich environments where salmon runs and ocean harvests supported dense populations. They built permanent villages, carved massive canoes, and created social hierarchies based on wealth and lineage. These were not societies waiting for civilization. They were civilizations, different from Europe, yes, but no less organized, no less complex. What changed in 1492 was not the arrival of people to an empty land. It was the beginning of sustained contact between worlds that had developed in isolation for thousands of years. And the consequences were immediate. Diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread faster than the people who carried them. Epidemics swept through populations with no immunity. Entire communities disappeared before they ever saw a European face. By some estimates, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of contact. Not from war alone, though there was war. Not from conquest alone, though there was conquest. But from disease, invisible, unstoppable, catastrophic. This was not a slow decline. It was a collapse, and it reshaped everything. Political alliances fractured. Trade networks broke. Knowledge was lost, as elders died without passing it on. By the time sustained European colonization began, much of what had existed in 1491 was already gone. What colonists encountered was not the full picture. It was the aftermath. The myth that took hold was this, that the continent had always been sparsely populated, that indigenous peoples were nomadic, simple, lacking in the structures that defined real civilization. This was not true. In the eastern woodlands, settlers found cleared fields and managed forests. In the southwest, they found multi-story buildings and irrigation canals. Along the Mississippi, they found earthworks so large they mistakenly attributed them to a lost race rather than the ancestors of the people still living nearby. But because these societies did not look like European cities, no stone cathedrals, no written records and alphabets colonists could read, no centralized empires in the European mold, they were dismissed. Indigenous governance was called primitive, though systems like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced early American democratic thought. Indigenous agriculture was overlooked, though it had sustained millions for centuries. Indigenous architecture was ignored, though it was often better suited to local climates than European designs. The misunderstanding was not accidental. It justified displacement. It erased history. It allowed entire peoples to be reduced to obstacles or curiosities. And that erasure persists. Even today, many people can name more Greek city-states than indigenous nations. Here is what we are rarely told. The diversity of indigenous North America was staggering. There were an estimated 300 distinct languages spoken north of the Rio Grande alone. More linguistic diversity than all of Europe. These were not dialects. They were separate language families, as different from each other as English is from Chinese. And this diversity extended to everything. Systems of governance ranged from egalitarian bands to hereditary chiefdoms. Economies ranged from nomadic hunting to intensive agriculture. Spiritual practices ranged from animism rooted in the land to complex cosmologies involving creation stories, celestial alignments, and sacred rituals. There was no single indigenous way of life. There were thousands. And this was not a weakness. It was an adaptation. Each society developed solutions suited to its particular environment, whether forest, desert, plain, coast, or tundra. To reduce them to a single narrative is to miss the point entirely. The descendants of these societies are still here. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still exists. Pueblo communities still occupy the same lands their ancestors built. The Navajo Nation is now the largest indigenous nation in the United States by population and land area. Languages that were nearly erased are being revived. Cultural practices that were banned are being reclaimed. Stories that were silenced are being told again. And across North America, place names, rivers, mountains, cities still carry the languages of the people who named them first. Understanding who lived here before 1492 is not just an academic exercise. It is a recognition that this history did not end. It continued. It continues. And It shapes the land we walk on today. Before this continent had the name North America, it had hundreds of names. Before it was a single map, it was 1,000 territories. Before it was one story, it was countless stories, woven together by the people who lived, built, and endured here for millennia. And those stories are still being told. If this changed how you see this land, consider following for more histories that don't make the textbooks.